Hey everyone, it's Alexi Uzas here from Accelerator. In this video, I'm going to answer the often asked question, how do you promise investors an ROI on your film? Now, before I get started, I want to let you know that spots are available for our Producing Accelerator program that helps filmmakers like you consistently finance, produce, and distribute your own films. So if that's something that you're interested in, stick around until the end of this video and I'm going to give you some more information about how that works. And for the best filmmaking advice, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to be notified when we post a video. The answer to the question, how do you promise investors an ROI on your film, is that you don't. Because film is so high risk, it's so speculative, that to promise investors that they're going to generate a return on their investment is not only ludicrous, but it's unethical. What you really need to do with investors is be completely upfront about the risks of investing in a film, about the potential of them actually losing their money and not making any of their money back, rather than trying to promise them some rainbow or some light at the end of the tunnel. Now, it's not to say that that isn't possible, right? We all know stories of films that absolutely hit the jackpot and everyone makes a lot of money from. But hitting the jackpot is exactly what the film industry is. It's a jackpot industry. It thrives off its wins, and the floor is absolutely littered with films that you've never heard of or that never even got close to returning their investment to investors. So the first thing about promising investors a return on their investment is that you absolutely shouldn't do that, and you should be completely open, transparent, and upfront about the potential risks of investing in the film. Now, the great thing about approaching it in this way is that you will only find the right investors for your project. So if you approach it in this way, if you're open about the risks, you're going to find investors that are willing to take the risk on your film. And so if it doesn't work out as planned or as you would have hoped, then at least you've A, been upfront about those risks, but B, you've also found the people that have gotten on board the project that are prepared to take that risk and that are going to be okay with the potential result. So it's also a really good way to weed out any investors that you don't want on the project and just find the right people for the project who understand the risk and who understand the high risk, high reward nature of investing in film. Now, when it comes to putting together projections or estimates for your film, which you're going to need in order to try and generate an investment for your project, then the best advice that I can give you is find comparables that are actually comparable. So there is nothing worse or nothing that is more of a sign to me that a filmmaker doesn't truly understand the nature of film investment, but also investment in general and finance in general, than when I see their comparable films and they're using outliers. And usually, this happens most common in the horror genre because there are so many examples of outliers that have done extremely well on a very low budget. So if I see comparables in a filmmaker's investment deck or lookbook that use, for example, Saw or The Blair Witch Project or Paranormal Activity or Get Out, then it's usually a sign that filmmaker doesn't really understand how to put together projections in a way that best represents their project. Because if you're just using these outliers as comparable films, then you're going to have projections or estimates that are highly skewed, that really show an extremely high rate of return, when those films don't represent the entire market. Like I said, they're outliers. So to base your finance structure, your finance model on these outliers is completely wrong. And going back to my last point, I do think that it's a way of luring investors into the project that isn't exactly an accurate reflection of the marketplace. So when it comes to putting together comparables for your project, don't just look at those films that went gangbusters. You can't create a financial structure based on outliers. So the factors that I look at when creating comparables, and the filmmakers that I work with look at, are the following. Number one, budget. So is the budget level of your film comparable to the budget level of the comparable film? The second is director's experience. So are you basing your comparables off directors who were at a similar stage in their career as you are with the film that you're making right now? The third, of course, is cast. So does the cast in your film accurately represent the cast in the other film, in the comparable film? Another one is the year. So this one's a really important one because releasing a film in 2021 or any year is very different to releasing a film even just a few years ago. You know, usually what we're looking for is comparables within the last 3 years, because that's going to give you a much more accurate picture of what the marketplace is currently doing than, say, if you're finding a comparable from 10 years ago, right? And especially with the introduction of streaming service and the boom of streaming services, you know, theatrical data today looks very different to what it looked like 5 or 10 years ago. So it's really important to find comparable films that are very recent, and the more recent, the better. And then finally, an obvious one is genre. So, you know, you want to be comparing horror films to horror films or dramas to dramas. And so really what we do is we look at all of these factors and make sure that the comparables are aligned with all those factors across those different factors. And the one thing that we do is we remove any outliers. So we don't factor in outliers because, like I said earlier, they're not a true representation of the overall market. And so it's not really accurate to put those in. Now, if you wanted to reference one of those films to show the potential of what could happen if the film went gangbusters, great. But to factor that into the projections and to factor that into the potential returns for an investor isn't exactly accurate. So those are the factors that we use to create comparables to make sure that the comparables that we're using are actually comparable to the film that we're pitching to investors. The next important point is to protect your downside. And when I say your downside, I mean the film's downside, and then by virtue of that, the investor's downside. So this is a concept that I picked up in the business world, and it's really all about how do you enter into a new venture or a new project or a new product and protect as much of your downside as possible. So protect as much of that risk as possible while giving yourself the most chance for upside. So this is really important when it comes to generating projections and promising, or like I said earlier, not promising, but conveying to investors what the potential returns of the film might be, is that you want to create your projections for your film based on the comparables, and then really look at what the worst case scenario is, the mid case scenario, and the high case scenario of those projections. Once you have those, and you can do that by looking at the different data that's available out there. We have our own specific formula that we've created that we use to basically create these low, medium, and high projections. But once you've done that and you have the low projections, you have the low return on investment for an investor, it's important that your private investment component of the project is in line with that low, projection or your downside. So what that basically means is once you know what your worst case scenario is, trying to have your private investment as close to that worst case scenario as possible is going to give you and your investors the best chance of generating an ROI for your film. So if you work out that your worst case scenario is that the film makes $50,000 back, then your private investment component for the project should be around $50,000. Because what that's doing is it's protecting your downside, it's protecting the risk of your investors, and it's protecting the risk of the film. And you might say, well, what if I find out what the worst case scenario is, but I just can't make the film for that amount of money? Well, I'm going to come back to that point in this video and explain to you why it's important that you really figure out how to handle that situation. Now, an example of this in practice is when I made my second film, which was a film called West of Sunshine. We made that film for a cash budget of around $55,000. The reason that we did that was because my first film, which was a horror film, made around $55,000 back. And that film didn't get into any major festival, didn't get any major distribution. So once I'd been through that process and I saw that that film made around $55,000 back without, going gangbusters or hitting the jackpot or getting into a major festival, I felt relatively confident that my next film could make at least that amount back. So that became the budget of my second film. And of course, because I protected my downside, that film generated a return on its investment. And that film also went on to premiere at Venice, got nominated for a bunch of awards, but purely from the financial side, we were able to generate a return on investment for our investors. Now, the flow-on effect from that result is that now when, I'm in the process of raising finance for that director's second film, and it's much easier to raise finance on a project if you have a track record of generating a return on investment for your previous films. So this is why protecting your downside isn't just important for that specific project, but it's really important because if you can protect your downside and generate a return on investment, and that return on investment is high, honestly, even if it's just a return on investment, but if you're protecting your downside, you've got the best chance of it being higher, then that's also going to help you raise finance on future projects. So that's another point, and it's another one of the, tips that I have when it comes to not promising, but conveying how you can generate a return for your investors. Another tip is to make sure that you understand distribution and how distribution actually works and how revenue from a film is distributed between the various parties. So earlier in the video, I spoke about having developed a formula to create projections based on data to show how much a film could make. And then to use those projections to generate investment for a project. Now, the only reason that I can do that, and I can do that confidently, is because I understand how distribution works, and I understand how a film's rights are exploited, and how the revenue from that project comes back to the production company and then goes back to investors. So there are a number of parties that the revenue has to flow through before it even reaches a production company. So for example, if the film gets released in cinemas, the cinema's going to take a cut. If there's a distributor, they're going to recoup their P&A first. They're going to recoup their advance. They're going to recoup any other costs, any capped costs. If there's a sales agent that sold the film to a distributor, they're going to recoup their advance. They're going to recoup their marketing expenses. Only then is the revenue from the film going to come into the production company. Once it's in the production company, it has to go through a waterfall. It has to pay back investors, or it has to pay back any gap financing first if there's any gap financing. Then your private investors usually, and that gets paid back at 120%. Then it has to pay back any other third-party investors. then you get to net profit, and that is split in a certain way between all the different parties. So basically, if any of this isn't making any sense to you, or if you can't sit down in front of a spreadsheet and go from cinema to net profit and know exactly what those percentages are and what those figures are that are going to come out. So percentages as in commission, and figures as in like marketing expenses or distribution expenses, then it's going to be very difficult for you, if not impossible, to create accurate projections. And if you can't create accurate projections, then this goes back to my first point, which is that you're likely not going to be pitching the film in a way that's accurate to investors. And this is likely the reason that most people just use those outliers, because they don't really know how that revenue is going to be distributed, how money is going to get back to investors. So they just think, okay, well, why not just throw the best case scenario in there, and hopefully that will get investors excited. But as I mentioned, it's not really the accurate way to do it. It's not really the ethical way to do it. And also, it could lead to you getting investors into the project who actually aren't the right fit for your project. So understanding how distribution works and how revenue is generated for a project, how it's split between all the various parties, what all those different expenses are that are going to come out before it gets to a production company, and then once it's in the production company, how the waterfall works, is really vital to being able to put together accurate projections and then raise private investment. The other reason it's extremely important to understand distribution is because if you're the producer of the project, you know the way that you're going to generate a return for investors is to have the film distributed. So, the natural extension of that is that you need to know how distribution works. You need to understand everything that I just spoke about, but you also need to understand, well, who are the good distributors in the marketplace? Who are the not so good distributors in the marketplace? What is the right way to attach distribution and when? There are different ways to do that. You can attach distribution and sales agents, as part of the financing stage. Sometimes it's better to actually not sell your distribution rights before the film's made. So understanding not only how distribution works, but how you should be applying it to your specific project is a vital part of the producer's job. And it's extremely important for you to understand how it works, so that when you're pitching to investors, you're pitching the right way, but also, if they have any questions, you're able to answer those questions, not only with confidence, but with confidence that's actually backed up by knowledge. The more that you can do that, the more confidence the investor is going to have in you, but then importantly, the more chance the film is going to have of succeeding, and the more chance you're going to have of generating a return. The final point that I want to leave you on is that this is a job. If you want to be making films and you need to raise finance as part of that process, and which means you need to be raising private investment. Every film has some level of private investment in it, unless it's funded by studios. So if you're going to go down that path of making films and you're going to be raising private investment, then everything I just spoke about is part of the job. This is the gig. And so going back to what I spoke about earlier about coming up with projections for a film and realizing what that downside is, that is the point that as a producer, as a filmmaker, you need to decide how you're going to structure the film. So it's not enough for you to simply come up with a budget for the film and then just try and raise that amount of finance without having any research or correlation, to what the film can actually make in the marketplace. Now, I'm not saying you can't do that. Of course, you can go and do it, but I don't think that it's the right way to do it. I think if you're going to be raising finance from private individuals and you're going to be doing that on the basis that you are saying that the film can generate a return, or that you're conveying that, these are the potential returns that it could make, then the onus and the responsibility is on you as the producer to then make sure that the budget and the level of private investment you're trying to raise is correlated to the amount of money that the film can actually make back and the potential return on investment for your project. So if you go through that process and you realize that the film can only make $500,000 back, but you're trying to raise $1 million in private investment because your budget is $1 million, then you need to seriously think about whether that is the right financial structure for your film. And if it's not, then you need to think about redoing your financial structure and bringing it in line with the potential returns of the project. And if you can do this, then you're really setting yourself apart from a number of producers and filmmakers out there. And in my view, you're not only setting the film up for success because you're protecting your downside, you're making sure that it's in line with the private investment, you're giving yourself the best chance of the film making money. But like I said, if that film does generate a return, it's going to give you a case study, and it's going to give you or start to build your track record so that when you continue to try and raise finance for the project, you're off to the best start possible. And I think this is really the reason why by doing this, you're setting yourself up for success in the long term. So that's my last piece of advice for this video. Okay, so that's it for the video. If you like the video, hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, jump into the comments and let me know what you thought about the content of the video. This was one of probably the funnest or most enjoyable videos that I've done because it does speak to something that I believe isn't really spoken about too much when it comes to film finance, and is something that is difficult to really get some advice or useful tips from. So if there's any other part of the film financing process that you want to know about, or that you don't understand, or that you feel like is in the dark and you don't have access to, I'd love to hear about what that is so that I can address it in these videos. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I want to let you know that spots are available for our Producing Accelerator program. So what that is it's an online program that takes place on a rolling basis, and it basically is me distilling every piece of knowledge, information, skills, tools, software, principles, everything that I've developed over the past 5 to 6 years financing films, and really distilling that into a system that any filmmaker can follow. So this isn't just a system that I use to finance my film, it's now a system that other filmmakers like you are using to finance, produce, and even attach distribution to their films. So if you want a system that allows you to finance your own films, that allows you, to put together accurate projections and to go out there and raise private finance, to attach distributors to your project, to get your films into production consistently, then head to the link in the description. You'll be able to check out a short video where I take you through our system step by step, and then you'll be invited to set up a time to speak with either me or a member of my team. And we'll be chatting about your project, working out where you're at right now, where you're trying to get to, and if the accelerator is the right fit for you. And as always, check out these videos next on how to up your filmmaking game.